A book like Acts marks a transition in redemptive history so that not all of it is normative for today. How does a pastor, how does an average Christian decide what things in the book of Acts are normative and what are not? Joe, you can't defer all questions to him.
Watch me. Okay.
After you.
He'll clean up after what you said.
Okay, let's do that. Is beauty before age? Is that what we're doing? Okay. That was a joke. I would say, so when the kind of the prescriptive versus descriptive distinction that often gets used when dealing with narrative text in the Bible is useful as far as it goes. But one of the things I was trying to do in my talks was to say, even where there's not a one-to-one correspondence between whatever the historical occurrence was in Acts and the present day, there are still patterns that we can identify. And I think that's true not just in Acts or in the Gospels, but throughout the Bible. These are authoritative accounts of how God has dealt with his people in the world, and therefore they ought to be instructive to us. There's patterns. If you want to call them types, we could call them types. There's ways that God consistently acts, and therefore, insofar as you can line up the relevant parallels between the scriptures and, say, the present day, you can discern principles that can help you anticipate or discern what your responsibility is as a Christian today. So that's a little bit different than just a simple, it's descriptive, it's just information for us to know that God has done this, versus prescriptive, it's a command, you must do this right now. It's attempting to kind of recognize the way that narratives in particular can function in this worldview shaping, mind shaping, training the imagination in the patterns of God's acting. And so that's typically how I think about when I'm reading to preach or reading to teach. I'm thinking those two horizons of the biblical text and the contemporary world, my congregation, and I'm trying to see what are the relevant patterns over here that match up over here, and then to try to draw those connections.
I agree with all of that completely. With the over here being, at least in some measure, outside the book of Acts. In other words, narratives have their own way of making a rhetorical appeal. They're not prescriptive, that's right. But on the other hand, to take a couple of hard examples that sort of give feet to what was already said. The only place in the New Testament from Acts on where you decide an appointment by lot is found in Acts chapter 1 for replacement apostle. There's nothing in the pastoral epistles, for example, that say the way you find elders in the early church is now by casting lots. Who gets the short straw or the long straw, as the case may be. So one is very loath to run from the one example to a kind of universal principle about how to do things when there are so many examples that are not that way, and there are lots of one-offnesses of that particular narrative. And same even with something like speaking with tongues or the phenomena of Acts 2. However much you want to make Acts 2 normative, I don't personally know any charismatic churches that meet and have flames of fire on people's heads with rushing wind going through the building. And moreover, the function of the tongues in that chapter is really quite different from the function of tongues in 1 Corinthians 12 through 14. And so one wants to note the commonalities, but also the differences, and proceed with care. Where the locks can be made, then they should be made strongly. But as you rightly said, there is at least some element of transition going on in the book of Acts about which we should be pretty careful.